She always thought that their love was strong and their marriage was honest, but after Jim Taylor's death, Margaret found out a secret he never told her about a past buried in war, a letter that changed everything, and a search for answers that could change the story they thought they knew. Before we start the story, let me know where you're watching from today. The bedroom was dark, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with the old air. The heart monitor beeped irregularly, a grim reminder of how little time Jim Taylor had left. The bed is once strong frame now reduced to frail skin and bones. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle. Margaret sat beside him, her fingers curled around his weak, calloused hand. They had been married for over 40 years, had built a life together, had raised 3 children, but now she could feel him slipping away. Emma, their eldest daughter, hovered by the doorway, arms folded, her face tight with unspoken grief. The boys Adam and Will were still on the road, trying to make it in time. Margaret wasn't sure they would. Jim stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They were cloudy, unfocused, but there was something behind them, something unresolved. He tried to speak, but his voice was barely a rasp. Margaret leaned in, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. "I'm here," she whispered. "We're here." His grip tightened slightly. "I need to tell you something," he coaxed, his voice barely audible. "Before I go." Margaret swallowed hard. "You don't have to." "I do," he interrupted, his breathing shallow. His gaze flickered to Emma, then back to his wife. "You both need to know." Margaret glanced at her daughter. Uneasy. "Know what?" Jim licked his cracked lips, struggling for air, then barely above a whisper he said it. "Lynn." Margaret frowned, a chill creeping up her spine. What? Jim's cloudy eyes found hers, and for the first time in decades she saw something she had never expected. "Regret?" "Lynn," he repeated, his voice fragile but certain. "She was everything." Margaret sat very still. In over 40 years of marriage she had never heard that name before. The heart monitor beeped. The air in the room grew heavier. Emma stepped forward. "Who was Lynn?" "Jim." He let out a sigh, his eyes widening as if he were looking at something far away. Suddenly, the past came flooding back to him. Who was Lynn, and what secrets has Jim been keeping all these years? Like the video and keep watching to find out. The air was thick with the smell of oil and burning rubber, and the heat and humidity were pressing down on the makeshift repair station like an unmovable weight. Jim Taylor wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaving grease on his forehead. The broken-down Jeep in front of him was just another in a long line of worn-out machines. Down by the war. Jim wasn't a combat soldier. He fixed things, kept them running. He'd always been good with his hands, something he learned from his father back in Kentucky. Aiming with old engines in their garage. When he enlisted at 18, he had no illusions about being a hero. He just wanted out of the dead-end town, out of the expectations that loomed over him like a storm cloud. The war had seemed like a way forward, but now, standing in the sweltering heat of Vietnam, watching helicopters take off with men who might not come back, he wasn't so sure anymore. His hands worked automatically, lightning bolts chucking wires while the distant sound of gunfire echoed through the hills. The base was never truly quiet. Even in moments of calm there was always the hum of tension, the knowledge that an ambush could come at any time. "Hey Taylor, you done babying that damn Jeep?" Luke Callahan, a wiry soldier with an easy grin, leaned against the hood lighting a cigarette. "Henderson and I are heading into town. You coming?" Jim straightened, rolling his shoulders. He wasn't much for drinking or chasing trouble, but a change of scenery sounded better than another night listening to engines groan beneath his hands. "Yeah," he muttered, tossing his rag onto the workbench. "Why not?" The town outside the base was a world away from the war, streets lined with vendors selling fresh fruit and rice bowls, children weaving through the crowds, laughter and chatter filling the air. It almost felt normal until you noticed the glances, the hesitation, the way people stiffened when an American soldier passed by. Some were welcoming, some were wary, and some, Jim knew, were quietly waiting for the moment to strike back. Luke led the way down a narrow street, stopping in front of a small tea shop tucked between 2 vendors selling woven baskets and dried fish. The sign above the entrance was in Vietnamese, the paint peeling. It didn't look like much, but Luke swore by it. "Best damn tea you'll ever have," he said, pushing open the door. Inside the air was cooler, the scent of jasmine and ginger cutting through the lingering humidity. A handful of American soldiers were already there, laughing, playing cards, their voices too loud for the small space. Jim's eyes swept over the room before landing on her. She stood behind the wooden counter, hands busy wiping down porcelain cups, her dark eyes flickering toward the soldiers but never lingering. She was young, early 20s maybe, and had a quiet grace about her, something entirely unfazed by the noise around her, unlike the other women in town who either smiled too easily at the Americans or shrank away. She seemed indifferent. That alone caught his attention. She must have felt his gaze, because her eyes lifted, locking onto his for a moment. Neither of them moved. Then she turned away, retreating a teapot from the back shelf as if he wasn't even there. Jim sat at a small wooden table near the counter while Luke and Henderson took seats closer to the ruddier soldiers. The girl Lynn, according to the delicate lettering on her name tag, moved through the shop with practiced ease, pouring tea, collecting coins, nodding politely but never engaging beyond what was necessary. When she approached his table, Jim noticed the way her fingers curled around the tray, the slight tension in her shoulders. "What do you want?" she asked, her English careful, deliberate. He hesitated. "Just tea." A nod, no smile, no unnecessary words. As she poured, he watched her hand, steady, precise. He should have looked away, should have kept his head down like he always did, but something about her presence unsettled him in a way that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. "Been working all day," he found himself saying, surprising even himself. "The heat out there's brutal." She didn't reply at first, simply placing the steaming cup in front of him. Then, without looking up, she murmured, "You chose to come here." Jim blinked. He wasn't sure if she meant Vietnam or just the tea shop. Either way, she wasn't wrong. He took a sip, letting the warmth settle in his chest. "It was damn good tea." "I'm Jim," he said finally. She met his gaze again, studying him for a beat longer than necessary. Then quietly she said, "Lynn," and just like that something shifted. The tea shop became a habit. Jim found himself there more often than he intended, stopping by after long shifts at the motor pool, drawn to the quiet hum of conversation and the scent of jasmine curling through the air. It wasn't just the tea, though he'd come to appreciate it. It was the stillness of the place, the way it seemed untouched by the war outside. Or maybe, he admitted to himself, it was her. Lynn rarely spoke to him beyond taking his order, but she didn't have to. There was something in the way she moved, calm, deliberate, that made the noise in his head settle, even for just a little while. Unlike the girls who flirted easily with American soldiers or the locals who eyed him with suspicion, she treated him like something else entirely. Not a friend, not an enemy, just a man passing through. Still, he noticed the way she lingered at his table a little longer each time, the way her eyes followed him when she thought he wasn't looking. "You keep coming here," she said one evening as she sat down. His tea, Jim smirked, stirring the cup with the back of his spoon. "Maybe I like the tea." Lynn gave him a flat look, unimpressed. "No, you don't." That made him chuckle. He wasn't used to people calling him out so easily. "All right," he admitted, glancing around the dim shop. "Maybe I just like the quiet." She nodded, once satisfied, before slipping away to another table. Jim sat back, watching her move, realizing for the first time that he wasn't just escaping the war, he was running towards something. Their talk started small, a few words here and there scattered between steaming cups of tea and the low murmur of other customers. Jim told her about home, his mother's cornbread, his father's short temper, the younger brother who had probably already grown taller than him. Lynn listened, with her fingers moving along the edge of a cup. "Do you miss it?" she asked one night. Jim shrugged and said, "No." She seemed to understand that you left because of the war. "Where I'm from, you work, marry, and die in the same town," he said. Joining up seemed like a way to see more. He let out a sigh as he thought of the bodies he'd seen and the wounded men he'd helped pull from burning vehicles. "Now I wonder if I should have stayed," he said. Lynn nodded as if she knew. Answer in return, she told him about her childhood before the war, the river she used to swim in with her little brother, the sound of the market in the morning full of vendors calling out prices. "It used to be different," she said quietly. "Now my brother, he's almost a man, but he talks of things he does not understand. He wants to fight. He is too young." Jim thought about the boys who had been drafted straight out of high school, the ones who had died before they even learned how to live. War takes a lot of things from people, he said, makes them Believe in things they wouldn't otherwise. Lynn glanced at him, something unreadable in her expression. And you, what do you believe in? He hesitated, then admitted, I don't know anymore. For the first time she smiled, not wide, not open, but something small and knowing. I think she murmured, that means she still have something left to find. The first warning came from her uncle. Jim had just finished his tea when Lynn sat down across from him, her face carefully. Blake, you should not come here so much, he frowned, lowering his cup. Why? My uncle says people talk, they see you here too often. She glanced toward the street. It is not good. Jim leaned forward, slightly lowering his voice. Not good for who, me or you? Lynn's silence was his answer. The truth was, he had known this was coming. Americans weren't always welcome here, and the ones who got too close to local women, they were tolerated at best, hated at worst. He'd seen it before, the way men like him were warned off, how some were read out of places entirely. It wasn't just the locals either. His own superiors had noticed. Taylor, you best keep your head straight, Henderson had told him after catching him walking out of the shop alone. Command, don't take kindly to soldiers getting distracted. Jim had nodded, said nothing, but it hadn't changed anything, and now looking at Lynn he knew it wouldn't. I'll be careful, he told her, I promise. Her expression softened, but her eyes still held worry. Careful is not always enough. The night was warm, the stars unusually bright. When Jim found her standing outside the shop, arms wrapped around herself as she stared at the sky. You waiting on something? He asked, stepping beside her. She shook her head no. They stood there for a while, the silence stretching easy and familiar. I used to think, she murmured, that the stars meant something, that when you saw a shooting star you could make a wish and it would come true. Jim glanced at her. You don't believe that anymore? She was quiet for a moment, then she said, not in war. Jim exhaled slowly. He understood that the war had taken a lot of things from people who believe certainty, but then she turned to him, her gaze steady. Do you believe in fate? Jim tilted his head, considering. I don't know. I do, Lynn said softly, because somehow you are here and somehow I am here. The space between them felt smaller than it had a second ago. Jim swallowed, his pulse quickening. Lynn, I am afraid, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper, afraid that this is not meant to last, that war will take this too. He didn't know what to say to that. He didn't have answers. All he knew was that in that moment the war felt far away and she was right here. So when she leaned in, when her lips brushed his, when his hands found her waist, pulling her close, he didn't stop. It didn't want to. The war could have everything else, but it couldn't have this. The nights belonged to them. In the hours before dawn, when the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant rumble of artillery fire, Jim and Lynn stole whatever moments they could. It wasn't much. Quiet conversations behind the tea shop, hurried embraces in dim alleyways, but it was enough to pretend for a little while that the world beyond then didn't exist. Jim had never been good with words, but with Lynn he found himself saying things he never thought he would. When this is over, he whispered one night, his forehead pressed against hers, I want to take you back with me. Lynn's fingers tied frightened around his back. To America, he nodded. We'll figure it out. I'll get us out of here. I don't care how hard it is. She exhaled, the weight of reality settling between them. It won't be easy. I don't care. Lynn pulled back just enough to look at him, searching his face as if trying to believe him. You don't understand. Your country will not accept me. Jim knew she was right. Even in America, people like him, men who had seen too much loss, too much, weren't always welcomed home. What chance did a Vietnamese woman have? But that didn't change what he wanted. We'll figure it out, he said again with more conviction. I swear it. Lynn didn't answer. She only kissed him deep and lingering, as if she knew something he didn't. The convoy moved out. At dawn, Jim sat in the passenger seat of a jeep, rifle strapped to his chest, humidity pressing against his skin like a second layer of clothing. It was supposed to be a simple escort mission, supplies to a remote outpost, a routine drive through dense jungle roads. He had a bad feeling about it. The road was too quiet, the trees too still. Then all hell broke loose. The first explosion sent a shock wave through the convoy, a landmine ripping through the lead truck, sending flames and debris into the air. Shouts erupted over the radio, followed by the rapid crack of gunfire. Contact. Jim barely had time to react before a second explosion rocked the jeep. The world tilted. His body was airborne, weightless for half a second before he hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. Dirt and smoke filled the air. His ears rang, drowning out the chaos around him. Shadows moved through the trees. Vietcong soldiers, their figures blurred through his failing vision. Somewhere someone was screaming. Jim tried to move, but pain shot through his side, sharp and unrelenting. His fingers dug into the dirt, struggling for something, anything. To hold on to. His vision darkened, and the last thing he saw was fire swallowing the jungle, then nothing. The ceiling was white, too white. Jim blinked, his throat dry, the scent of antiseptic burning his nose, his body ached everywhere, deep-going pain that pulsed with every breath. When he tried to move, a shark sting shot through his ribs, and a low groan escaped him. "You're awake," a voice said. Jim turned his head, slightly squinting against the harsh light. A doctor stood beside his bed, an older man with weary eyes and a clipboard tucked under one arm, where his voice cracked barely more than a whisper. "Military hospital in Saigon. The doctor said you were injured in an ambush, shrapnel wounds, broken ribs, concussion. You're lucky to be alive." Jim let the words settle in his mind, trying to piece together the last thing he remembered: the convoy, the explosion, the jungle swallowing him whole. And then Lynn. His pulse quickened. I need to get a message out." The doctor gave him a look, the kind reserved for men who didn't understand the situation. "Son, you're being sent back to the United States," the doctor said. "What orders came down this morning? You're not in good enough shape to stay here. You'll be transferred to a hospital in Texas for long-term recovery." No, that was right. That wasn't how this was supposed to happen. "I can't leave," Jim said, pushing himself up despite the pain. "There's someone. I need to find her." The doctor's face stayed the same. "I'm sorry, Jim." Lynn was still out there. Didn't know what had happened to him. She was waiting, and now he was being torn away from her just like that. Helpless, he sank back against the pillow, staring up at the too white ceiling. The flight back to the U.S. was a blur of pain and drowsy morphine haze. Jim barely remembered landing, barely remembered the hands guiding him off the plane and into the sterile walls of another hospital, this one filled with men like him, broken, waiting to heal, but never quite whole. The first week he could barely move. The second he started writing letter after letter, he scribbled out words on thin hospital paper, addressing them to the only place he knew, Lynn's T-Shock, tucked away in the quiet streets of a war-torn town. He wrote about the ambush, about waking up in Saigon and finding out he was being sent away, about how he had fought to stay, how it hadn't mattered. He told her he was sorry, he told her he would come back for her, he told her to wait for him, and then he waited. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, no reply. At first he convinced himself it was just the distance, the slowness of war-torn mail, but as more time passed, doubt crept in. What if she never bought them? What if she thought he had abandoned her? What if she hadn't survived? Jim thought about asking the military for information, but he already knew the answer. There was nothing they could do, so he kept writing, sending letters into silence, holding on to hope like a man grasping at smoke. Jim counted time in painkillers and hospital meals. Days stretched into weeks, blurred by the monotony of physical therapy and the sterile hum of the Veterans Hospital Inn. His body slowly and painfully healed in Texas, but his mind stayed in Vietnam. The nurses were kind, but distant, and their voices were filled with the same rehearsed sympathy they gave every wounded soldier. He hated how they looked at him as if he were something to be pied. His fellow soldiers came and went. Luke visited once while walking on a crutch, and his usual sense of humor was dulled by exhaustion. They talked about meaningless things like baseball and home runs, but Henderson didn't make it. Jim learned that in a quiet conversation with a nurse who thought he was still asleep. Finally, after 2 months, he was allowed to go home. He stepped off the bus onto familiar pavement, but his hometown didn't feel like home anymore. Kentucky hadn't changed. The streets were still lined with the same faded storefronts. The diner on the corner still smelled of coffee and fried eggs, and the people still greeted each other with nods and knowing smiles. But Jim wasn't the same. His mother cried when she saw him, her hands trembling as she cued his face. His father offered a firm handshake and "Little else. Glad you're home, son," was all he said. Jim slept in his childhood room where everything felt too small, his bed, the walls, the life waiting for him. He sat through dinners listening to his parents talk about neighbors and church and politics, while his mind drifted to jungles and smoke and a woman he might never see again. "You need to start thinking about the future," his father told him one night over dinner. "Find work, settle down, war's over for you now." Jim stabbed his fork into his plate, suppressing the urge to snap back. The War wasn't over, it was just quieter here. His mother, softer than his father, reached across the table, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "You just need time, Jimmy." He wanted to believe that, but every night he lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet, wondering if Lynn was even alive. It started with small things. Jim had known Margaret years ago, back when life was simple and the biggest concern was getting home before his father started yelling. She had been a neighbor girl who sat 2 rows ahead of him in school, who always. She was a nurse at the town clinic and the only person besides his family who didn't treat him like he was broken. One day she saw him walking around town and stalked him. Jim Taylor almost didn't recognize her. Her face was older and more sure of itself, but her eyes were still warm. "I heard you were back," she said. "I work at the clinic. If you ever need anything, just say the word." He didn't know what to say, so Margaret was patient and didn't press him. Questions, didn't pry into things he wasn't ready to talk about. Instead, she shut up. She asked if he wanted to go for a walk. When she saw him restless, she left food at his mother's house. When she knew he wasn't eating right, Jim resisted. At first, he wasn't ready for someone like Margaret. He wasn't sure if he'd ever be, but the days passed, and she became part of them. She was steady, she was safe, and that he thought was the closest thing to peace he was going to get. Jim had never imagined himself the kind of man who married young before the war. Before Vietnam, he figured he'd spend his life fixing things, cars, machines, whatever needed working hands. He never saw himself settling into a routine, certainly not this soon. But 2 years after returning home, he stood beside Margaret in a small church, a borrowed suit stiff around his shoulders, saying vows he meant even if he couldn't fully feel them. Margaret was good to him. She was patient. When he woke up sweating in the middle of the night, tangled in sheets, breathing hard, she never asked questions he didn't want to answer. When he withdrew, when the weight of things unsaid pressed against him, she didn't push, she just waited. They built a life together. Jim took a job at a local auto shop using the skills he had honed in the military. The work was steady, his hands always busy, and most days it kept his mind from wandering too far. Margaret worked at the clinic, and in time they had their first child, a boy, Daniel. A few years later, a daughter, Emma. The house they moved into was small but warm, the kind of place that should have made a man feel like he belonged. And yet there were nights when Jim sat at the kitchen table staring at the yellowed edges of old letters, the ones he had written, the ones that never came back. Jim never talked about Vietnam, not with Margaret, not with his friends, not even with the men in town who had been there too. But the memories didn't fade. On certain days, anniversaries of battles he didn't want to remember, he'd find himself in the garage, hands gripping a wrench too tightly, mind drifting thousands of miles away. Sometimes at night, Margaret would wake to find him sitting on the porch staring at nothing. She would join him, sitting beside him in the dark, and though she never asked what home haunted him, she always reached for his hand. He appreciated her for that. And yet there was one thing he never told her. Lynn. Do you think James should have tried harder to find Lynn? Should he have told Margaret about Lynn before they got married? Comment your thoughts below. It wasn't that he didn't love Margaret, he did, in his own way, but part of him had been left behind in a country he would never see again, and that was something he didn't know how to explain. What good would it do? What could it change? So he kept it buried, tucked away, just like the letters in the drawer across the ocean, in a world he had been forced to leave behind. Lynn had waited. She had searched for Jim, sending letters through whatever channel she could, desperate to find out what had happened to him. But the war swallowed their connection whole. His letters never reached her, and hers never made it past the chaos of a collapsing country. Then she realized she wasn't just waiting for him anymore, she was carrying his child. Jim Taylor had a son, a boy who would grow up never knowing his father's name. While Jim built a life in America by getting married, working, and raising his own children, his first child, the one he never knew existed, grew up on the other side of the world, waiting for answers that never came. Jim had never been easily scared. He had been to war and crawled through jungles where one wrong step could kill He had watched men take their last breaths, had carried the weight of loss on his back for decades, but as he stood in his kitchen staring down at the envelope in his trembling hands, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Fear. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper was creep, as if it had been handled too many times before finally making its way to him. His name was written on the front in bold, steady strokes: James Taylor, with no return address, no indication of where it had come from or who had said it. He swallowed hard, his pulse hammering as he slid his finger under the flap and pulled the letter out. It was short, just one line: "Your son is looking for you." Jim's breath stopped as he read the words over and over. His fingers tightened around the paper, crumpling the edges. His chest hurt and his mind was racing. A son. He lowered himself into the kitchen chair and stared at the letter as if it might disappear if he blinked. This couldn't be real. It had been over 40 years since Vietnam and he had seen Lynn. She was the only woman who could have sent him a letter like this, but she wouldn't have, not after all this time, unless she had never given up, unless she had carried a truth that he never knew existed. He closed his eyes, his breathing shallow. A son. Jim didn't tell Margaret he wanted to. He almost did twice, but both times when he saw her moving about the house, humming softly as she folded laundry or reading a book in the ward armchair by the fireplace, he stopped himself. How could he say it? How could he tell her that? All these years there had been someone he never knew about, that before her, before their children, before the life they built together, there had been another life waiting for him on the other side of the world. What if it was a mistake? What if he chased ghosts and found nothing? What if it was too late? He told himself to let it go, to put the letter away, pretend it never came, but he couldn't. It sat on the kitchen seat staring at him, haunting him. "Your son is looking for you," and Jim had never been able to leave a question unanswered. He started by checking the envelope again, hoping for some overlooked detail. There was nothing: no return address, no markings except the post office stamp. His next step was reaching out to the men who had been with him in Vietnam. He dug through an old box in the attic, pulling out yellowed letters and notebooks, searching for names. Some of his old unit had passed away, some had drifted unreachable. He called Luke Callahan, now an old man with a scratchy voice that had lost the careless ease it once held. "Jesus Taylor, been years since I heard from you. What's got you digging through the past?" Jim hesitated, then carefully he asked, "You remember that tea shop in Dang?" Luke was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "I remember you visiting it every chance you got. You ever hear what happened to that town?" Another pause, then war took most of it. "Jim, you know that?" Jim grit his teeth. "I need to know if anyone made it out, if anyone." He stopped himself. He couldn't say the words out loud. Luke sighed. "I wish I had answers, but we left, man. We got shipped home." "We did." A look back, Jim. He clenched his teeth and gripped the phone tighter as he thanked Luke, but it wasn't enough. Since his old friends hadn't answered, Jim turned to more official sources. He called and looked through military records, refugee lists, immigration documents, and old reports, but every call and inquiry led him to the same dead end. There was nothing. Lynn's name wasn't in the records because the town had been destroyed and its people had been scattered, and any paper trail had been lost in the shuffle of a country that had moved on. The letter in his hand proved that someone somewhere had found him. Someone knew the truth, but was it real, or was it just another thing the war had stolen from him, teasing him with something he would never find? Jim sat at the kitchen table late into the night, the letter resting beside his callous hands. For the first time in years he felt truly restless. Somewhere out there his son was looking for him, and Jim had no idea where to begin. Margaret found the letter 2 days after Jim passed. She wasn't wasn't looking for anything really there. House had fallen into a hush, the kind that settled into the walls after a funeral. The silence was heavier than grief, filling the spaces Jim used to occupy. She had been folding his shirts, methodically pressing out creases that no longer mattered, when she found it tucked in the drawer of his nightstand, a simple envelope worn at the edges, its contents brief but powerful. "Your son is looking for you." Margaret sat down, the fabric of Jim's flannel shirt still bunched in her hands as she reread their words. She should have felt betrayed. She should have been angry, but instead all she felt was sorrow, deep quiet sorrow, not for herself but for the man she had spent her life with. Jim had carried this alone. He had looked for answers and found none, had wanted to tell her and couldn't. Margaret let out a slow breath, smoothing the letter on her lap. She had known Jim wasn't whole when she met him. She had known that parts of him had been left in a country he never spoke of, in memories he never shared. She had accepted, did that because love was not about being first, it was about being chosen every day, and Jim had chosen her. That had always been enough. She placed the letter back where she found it, pressing it flat. Then softly she whispered, "I hope he finds him." Emma found out first. She had been the one Margaret trusted with the letter, handing it over with steady fingers, her face unreadable. "You should see this," was all she said. Emma had grown up watching her father wrestle with things he never said aloud. Now for the first time she understood why she read the letter twice, then again, as if trying to will more words onto the page. "More answers, a brother," she murmured, the words tasting unfamiliar. "I have a brother." Daniel, on the other hand, took longer to process it. Unlike Emma, who had always felt close to their father despite his silence, Daniel had spent years trying to understand JY and failing to him. Their father had always been distant, present in body but not always in spirit, and now this. So all this time he had another kid. Daniel's voice was flat when Emma told him, his arms crossed over his chest. Emma hesitated. "I don't think he knew." Daniel scoffed. "Doesn't change much, does it?" He tried. "Danny," he looked, "you know, Dad, if he didn't care he would have done that." Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "What do you want to do?" Emma didn't even hesitate. "I'm going to find him." Emma started with Veterans Organization. She had no name, no location, nothing except the fact that her father had served in Vietnam and that somewhere out there a man was searching for him. It wasn't much, but it was something. She learned quickly about the Amoras, the children born to Vietnamese women and American soldiers. Many had been left behind or abandoned after the war. Some had made it to the U.S. through immigration programs, while others had stayed behind because they were stuck in a country that didn't always want them. Each call-in question sent her further down a path that felt both overwhelming and inevitable. Finally, she found a lead, a name buried in old immigration records connected to a Vietnamese refugee who had settled in California decades ago. Her father had looked for it but couldn't find it, but Emma wasn't going to stop until she had answers. Taylor never expected a call like this. For 53 years he had lived without a father. He had told himself 1,000 stories about the man whose absence shaped his life. Some were kinder than others, some were bitter, resentful, but deep down he had always believed one thing: his father had left him behind. He had been raised in Saigon by a mother who never once spoke poorly of the American soldier who had given her a child. Lynn had always said the same thing: your father was a good man, war took him away. Not his choice, it should have been enough. But as men grew older, as he faced the stares of those who saw him as neither fully Vietnamese nor fully American, the questions never stopped. Where was his father? Why hadn't he come back? Had he even tried? Men had come to the U.S. in the late 80s as part of the Amorian Homecoming Act. By then he had already built a hard shell around himself, one that protected him from disappointment. He had started over in California, carving out a life that was his and his alone. He learned English, worked jobs no one else wanted, took night classes. Eventually he built something for himself, a business, a home, a family of his own. But the past had never truly left him, and now, decades later, it had finally caught up. Min was in his office when the phone rang. He almost didn't answer. The caller ID showed a Kentucky number, unfamiliar, probably a scam, but something made him pick up. "Hello." The voice on the other end was hesitant. "A woman. Is this Min Taylor?" He frowned. "Who's asking?" A pause, then carefully, "My name is Emma Taylor. I think we might be family." Min sat up straighter, his grip tightening on the phone. "I don't understand." She hesitated. He could hear the nervousness in her breath. "My father," she said, "was James Taylor. He served in Vietnam. He passed away recently, but before he died he received a letter. Someone told him he had a son." Silence. Men stared at the desk in front of him, feeling the weight of the moment press against his chest. Saying he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Emma filled in the rest. "I think you're my brother." Men didn't know what to say. For 50 years the story in his mind had remained unchanged. His father was just another soldier who left another man who moved on, but now he was hearing that Jim Taylor had looked for him. He had tried to find the truth, and yet the ache in Men's chest was a relief. It was anger. Why now? He asked. His voice was low, controlled, but inside everything churned. Why did he wait until he was dying? Emma didn't have an answer. I don't think he knew about you, she admitted. Not until that letter arrived. Men exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. His mother had never spoken of sending letters, never mentioned trying to contact Jim. Had she tried and failed? Had she kept the pain from him to protect him? He had spent his whole life assuming his father had forgotten him. What if he had been wrong? Still, he wasn't sure. He wanted to know. What do you want from me? He asked. Emma was quiet for a moment, then softly she said, nothing, but I thought you deserved to know. Min closed his eyes. For so long he had convinced himself he didn't care about the past, that it didn't matter, but now it was. After the phone call, Emma sent him everything: pictures of Jim, old war medals, and letters he had written to Lynn but never got to send. Min's hand shook as he laid them out in front of him. The man in the pictures didn't look anything like the father he had imagined. He was a real man who had loved, lost, and tried. Min found a finger over one of the letters, reading the words his father had written long before he even knew he existed. Lynn, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I was hurt. They sent me back to the States before I could find you. I swear I didn't leave by choice. I need to know if you're safe. Min swallowed hard. All his life he had wanted an answer, and now it was time to find it. He picked up his phone and called Emma back. When can you come to California? The cafe was small and quiet, the kind of place that smelled like fresh coffee and carried the hum of conversation spoken just above a whisper. Emma sat at a table near the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had barely touched. She glanced at the door every few seconds, waiting. She had flown across the country for this. When men finally arrived, she knew it was him immediately. His features were different from her father's: sharper cheekbones and narrower frame, but there was something familiar in the way he carried himself, a quiet heaviness, like a man who had spent his whole life trying to outrun the past. Men hesitated near the door and looked around the room before focusing on her. Emma stood up and gave him a small, nervous smile. Min nodded and stepped forward. Emma and Min sat there for a long time without speaking. The weight of what had brought them here pressed down on them, filling the space with unspoken questions. Finally, Min broke the silence. His voice was steady, but there was something raw in it. Did he even try to find me? Emma knew what he was going to ask, but it still made her chest tighten. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small stack of letters. The paper was yellowed from age and the ink was a little faded, but the words were still clear. She slid the letters across the table and Min hesitated before picking one up. He carefully brushed the edges of the paper with his fingers as he exhaled. He put the letter down and thought about it for a moment before speaking. My mother never stopped waiting, he said. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet ache beneath it. She wrote as many letters as she could, but she never knew if they got to him. Emma's throat tightened, but she never got a response. Min shook his head, no response. He swallowed and looked away for a second, gathering himself. She always told me the same thing: your father was a good man. War took him away, not his choice. She believed it until the day she died. Emma blinked. She's gone. He nodded. Illness. Something that could have been treated if we had the right care, but we didn't. She never got to know if he tried to come back for her. Separated by things out of their control, Min took a slow breath, looking down at the letter once more. I used to think she was lying to me, that she told me what she wanted to believe, but now he read a hand over his face, then met Emma's face. Now I don't know what to believe anymore. Then he opened one of the letters. Lynn, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I was hurt. They sent me back to the States before I could find you. I swear I didn't leave by choice. I need to know if you're safe. Min swallowed hard. He set the letter down and reached for another. I keep writing, but I don't know if they reach you. If you see this, know that I never forgot about you. His shoulders tensed up, and his fingers gripped the paper just a little tighter. He had spent his whole life thinking that his father had left him and never looked back. And now, here it was, the truth Jim had tried to find, even when it led to dead ends. He wanted to know for the first time. The anger, the resentment, didn't vanish, but it loosened, and in its place something else settled in, something closer to peace. Margaret met men a few days later. Emma had worried about how it would go, about how her mother would feel meeting the son her husband had never known, but when Margaret greeted men at the door there was no hesitation, no distance. She simply looked at him, truly looked at him, then reached for his hands and held them between hers. Jim carried love for your mother until the day he died, she said softly. You weren't forgotten. Men nodded. He didn't know what to expect from Margaret. He was ready for discomfort, reluctance, or anything else that might remind him that he was an outsider, but she didn't have any of those things. Instead, she welcomed him into the home where Jim's memory still lingered, in the family that was still learning how to move on. Jim Taylor was buried in a quiet cemetery just outside of town under a simple headstone that bore his name and the number of years he had served. No other men stood before it, and the wind rustled the trees around him for a lifetime of unspoken words pressing against his chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small worn photograph of his mother. Gently he placed it at the base of the headstone. He exhaled, then, voice barely above a whisper, said, "I found you, Dad." For the first time in his life, Min felt like he belonged somewhere. The last evening of Min's visit, they all sat together, Emma, Margaret, Daniel, and men gathered around the dining table, plates half full. Conversation quiet but steady. They weren't strangers anymore, they were something else. Men had spent his whole life searching for answers, and here in the home of a man he had never met, with a family that had lost just as much as he had, he realized something. He wasn't just Jim Taylor's son, he was part of his story, and that finally was enough. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, did this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.